Hey YouTube, what's up? Steve here, and I wanted to make a video talking about how I prep my kits for painting. Now, a lot of things I'm going to cover here today have been covered in many other videos by many other YouTubers, but everybody has their own techniques, and I just kind of wanted to share mine because I've got a few techniques that I don't think are very common, so I just wanted to share those and just kind of go over some of the basics in case some YouTuber or modelers out there are not too familiar with some of these techniques and how they're used and why they're used. That's probably the most important part. So basically what I want to cover is seam line removal, and then seam line cleanup, as well as how I sand my kits. You'll notice a towel here that has to do with how I sand my kits. And also, I'm going to cover briefly how to use epoxy putty. It's not necessary for most kits, but you never know when epoxy putty will come in handy, so I just wanted to cover that. So I'm going to let you guys go ahead and figure out how to assemble your kits. So every kit is different, so I can't say there's a right way to assemble every kit. But when you're removing seam lines, you need to really plan ahead and think about how you're going to paint it, how you're going to mask parts off to color separate and everything. I've got an example here where I have masked off the visor and the camera before I cemented this piece together to remove the seam line. That way I can just paint it, top coat it and everything, and then once everything is said and done, just remove that masking tape and the visor will be crisp and clean. So a lot of times something like this you're going to have to pre-paint it if you need to paint it. In this case, this piece is just a clear green piece that doesn't need paint, so that's just good to go. But I have in the past just painted that part beforehand. Another thing here, I've got two examples where these parts are all cemented together, so I cannot take these apart to paint the gray parts like separately, or in this case the orange and the brown parts. So what I'm going to have to do is mask off all these pieces before painting if I want to color separate them. So those are the kinds of things you need to think about when you're cementing pieces together to remove seam lines. So I'm going to let you guys figure all that out because every kit is different. Alright, so for seam line removal, I know this has been covered many times by other modelers, but I thought I would just go over it again in this video. So as an example, I'm just going to use this energy pack. So what I like to do is kind of align the pieces if I can, if they have pegs, so that they're aligned but there's still a gap between the two pieces. And I use Tamiya cement, but most liquid cements will work for this. And what I do is I just kind of get a good amount of cement on my brush and just kind of go between the two pieces with the brush. And I say a good amount, but don't drench your pieces in cement. What the cement is doing is it's going to melt the two parts so that when I squeeze it together, like I'm about to do, the two melted pieces of plastic are going to kind of create a bond, and that bond will be much closer than the two pieces could ever actually be by just like squeezing together, and that eliminates the seam line. Oh, one thing I didn't go over beforehand, which I wanted to, was what a seam line actually looks like if you were not to remove it. So on this piece, you'll see a seam line running down the center of it. And if you were to paint that with primer and then paint, that seam line will be very visible through your paint. So by creating a bond between the two plastic pieces, so you can see as I'm squeezing these pieces together, you see a nice bead of cement getting squirted out. And what's going to happen is I'll be able to sand this smooth, and basically that little gap between the two pieces, which is a seam line, will be completely filled with the combination of cement and melted plastic. And after sanding it smooth, when I paint it, that line will be completely invisible. Now, a couple tools I use for helping this process. This is a very simple piece to use, or to remove a seam line on, but other pieces can be very complicated, and what I find to be very helpful are clamps. I've got two different kinds here. These little quick grips, which apply considerably more pressure. They can squeeze down pretty hard. So I'm going to go ahead and just use this one. And just put enough pressure on there and just let it be for a few minutes. And there's also this kind, little clamps. Very helpful if you just need to hold a piece in place over a given amount of time for the cement to cure. These don't apply very much pressure, but they usually apply enough to get the job done. Now, once you apply this, you don't need to leave it for more than like 5 minutes, but that also depends on what piece you're using, how much cement you've used, and like how complex it is and stuff. So this piece is actually pretty good, and I can just set this aside. It takes a good 12 hours for this cement to fully cure, so I always try to cement all the pieces I need to the night before, so that I can paint or sand them the next day. And once this piece has fully cured, it'll look like this. So I did this piece last night, and all I need to do now is sand this smooth. Another thing I didn't mention, Tamiya's extra thin cement is very, very helpful as well for removing seam lines. This will flow very easily through small cracks and stuff in case you missed a spot. Alright, so sanding, so there are two things I need to cover when I talk about sanding. The first is just sanding normal pieces, and the second is sanding pieces that have had a seam line removed. So how I like to sand is I get a towel and a bucket of water over here, and I like to use sanding sponges. They have a nice flat surface. This is important because you always want to be sanding flush to a piece. You don't want to be sanding at angles where you can wear down at an angle. And what I do is I wet sand, meaning I keep my sponge or my sandpaper wet. What this does is it keeps the grit clean of dust for the most part, and it keeps dust from going everywhere, which is very helpful. All the models in this room are covered in dust because of sanding, so I've kind of switched to wet sanding to try to keep the dust down. Now these are two different grits. This is 3M's extra fine. This is 3M's fine grit. I use this more often, but the fine is very helpful for removing or sanding down parts that really require a lot of sanding. But this is much smoother, and it's what I use to finish a piece before priming it. If you use a sandpaper that's too coarse, you're going to be left with deep scratches that will show through your primer, so you got to be careful. And another thing about sanding is if you cut up some of your sponges, you'll have a much smaller piece that is very easy to get into smaller areas. For example, if you need to kind of get into here, where it might be very difficult to do so with a large piece like this, where you can't get flush to the part because it's just so big. So if you cut it up, you have a much smaller piece that can easily get into smaller areas. Now for removing seam lines, it's pretty simple. I try to start if I can with the extra fine, but it goes a lot quicker if you use the fine and just kind of lightly sand. And you'll see, if it'll focus, that up here the seam line is already starting to disappear as I've sanded that, all of that cement smooth and stuff, all that plastic and cement has been squirted through that little seam line. And I'm just going to go along the whole piece, sanding it until it's pretty smooth. Once everything is said and done, you'll be left with something that looks like that. So it's very smooth. If I were to prime that, I would not see a seam line. But the thing is, when you remove a seam line, you will often need to clean up afterwards. So what I do to clean up afterwards is I usually apply a thin layer of either Tamiya Putty or surface primer. So the advantage of using Tamiya Putty is that it's very easy to work with. It dries very quickly. The disadvantage is it's not very durable. It dries very soft and doesn't hold up very well. The advantages of using a surface primer is it dries very hard and is a very strong gap filler. But the disadvantage is that it takes a long time to dry. And this also isn't the best for every application. Most applications where you just need a simple gap fill, maybe just like small imperfections and stuff, Tamiya Putty is just quick and easy. But for pieces that have surfaces that could be uneven or are very messed up, there's a lot of imperfections in that seam line, there's like big divots and stuff, you'd want to use a surface primer. And I'm going to show you how to use that in a second. So I'm going to show you how to apply the surface primer and the putty. Here is a piece where there's a little dimple left from the mold making process. It's caused by hot plastic being injected from into a mold and it not cooling before they kind of remove it from the mold or something along those lines. And the best way to fix something like that is surface primer. Putty would not work quite as well, but it would work. So some examples of where I've used surface primer is on the chest. You'll see a few spots here and there where the surface primer is actually filled in little areas that were lower than the surrounding sections. So it's kind of filled in little gaps and stuff. Surface or putty could have easily been scratched off, even though it may have been lower than the rest of the pieces. It's just very soft and it's not good for heavy duty piece restoration. Here's another example of where I've used primer. This piece was very messed up. It's basically 3 pieces that have been cemented together and then sanded smooth. After sanding, I then applied some primer around all the seam lines and stuff, and after sanding it smooth, you can see where the primer has filled in any uneven spots. And up here you can see there was a very large gap. The primer mostly filled it, but I just went over it again with some putty just to finish it off. So the putty is good for lighter applications. Surface primer is better for heavy duty stuff. Now to apply the surface primer, just take a toothpick. You do want to mix it up, and a paint stirrer will really mix it up well. This has been pre-mixed, but I'm just going to mix it up a little bit with a toothpick. And on this piece, I'm just going to go ahead and try to get rid of that little dimple. So what I'm going to do is just apply a thin layer. And I'm going to try to get a little bit more inside of that gap. And there's another one over here. It's not quite as noticeable, but it's still there. Now this is going to take the night to dry. I'm going to go back and sand it tomorrow. But when I do, it's just going to be sanded smooth, and the only thing that'll be left are 2 little circles here and there where the primer has stayed inside those little dimples, but it's been sanded away from the rest of the plastic. Now I've shown how to use the putty before, but I'm just going to go over it again. Just get a toothpick and dab just a tiny bit on your toothpick. That's probably a little too much, but it'll work. And just apply a very thin layer, and you'll be left with something like that. Now I'm just going to give that like 15 minutes to dry. If you do a thin layer, it'll dry very quick. With putty, you do not want to apply a thick layer. Do not apply putty in thick layers. Putty is, or Tamiya putty is lacquer based. Mr. Hobby putty, I believe, is polyester based, but these are considered hots. Hots are like lacquers that will often bond with plastic by heating it up, melting it, and kind of bonding to it. So if you apply a large amount of putty, what it's actually going to do is it's actually going to melt into the plastic. So only apply it in thin layers. It's not meant for thick applications. Another thing I want to show you is masking. Now, I'm probably not a pro at masking, but I just wanted to show you one tip. If you're ever wondering how to mask off a piece like this, where you need to mask off this from this, basically, just take some masking tape, painter's tape, and I try to align it, align the edges, but for instances where you can't do that, basically you just can apply it like this, where I've just covered both pieces. This is a really bad example, but I just wanted to go over one thing. So if you apply it, then using a toothpick, you can go along edges. This is actually cutting through the tape, but if you apply pressure and go along the little seam caused by the 2 pieces joining, and basically you'll just press that masking tape into that gap. Wow, this worked very well, or sort of.
It's a little rough. Normally what I would recommend is using a razor now, and then just using the back edge, not the sharp edge, to just kind of go along that newly formed line that you created using a toothpick, and just kind of go through and make a couple passes just to cut the tape. And once you're confident that the tape has completely been cut, you can go ahead and peel it away, leaving you a very nicely masked off piece. So basically how I would approach this is I would I'd prime everything, paint using a lower pressure, for instance just this brown part. Then I'd mask that off and then paint the rest of it. So yeah, that's one way to mask. The other is just lining up the edge of the tape with the edge of the piece. That just kind of requires straighter parts. Some parts that are curved like this, you can't do that. So using a toothpick to go along the edge will work very well to help you cut the tape as you need to. Alright, now the last thing I want to cover was using 2-part epoxy putty, mostly because I've seen several videos where there are YouTubers talking about epoxy putty, and they miss one of the most basic things. So you'll see a little dish here. What I'm going to do is fill that with water. I've got a little water container so I can always have water when I need it. And to mix epoxy putty, it's very simple. So basically I'm just going to take a small amount, now I'm going to get an equal amount of the second part. So there's a lot of different kinds of sculpting putty, so I don't really have a preference to any particular brand, so I can't recommend any, but I'm sure they all work relatively the same. What most people miss, and which will make your life a lot easier, something I picked up from the Gundam Meister. If you haven't checked out his channel, go check him out. So if you dip your fingers in water, it's going to keep the epoxy putty from sticking. And if you've ever used epoxy putty without using water, you'll know why that's important. So once you have equal parts, you're just going to go ahead and knead it together until it's completely mixed, kneaded. And this can take a few minutes. Here is an example of where I've used some epoxy putty. You never really know when you're going to need it, so it's always just good to have around. It's not terribly expensive. If you do some scratch building, it's pretty much essential. What I'm going to do now is fill this gap here, and how I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to fill it from the inside. So I got to separate these two parts. And I'm just going to go ahead and take a little bit of this and just go ahead and wedge it in there. So the Gundam Meister has done a great tutorial on how to use this stuff exactly, but I'm just going to show you the basics. I've just got some cheap sculpting tools. I'm just going to go ahead and kind of smooth it out. and I don't need to get this perfect. I'm just going to go back later and sand that smooth once it's fully cured, which will take a few hours. I'm going to give it the night to dry. Come back to it tomorrow and sand that smooth. And I'm just going to go ahead and do the other side. So once epoxy putty is dried, it is very strong. And you can see here where I've used it to fill a gap that used to be a handle, but I needed to create a hole there for a polycap. So I basically just did the same thing I did with that right here, and once that had fully cured, I actually used a Dremel to kind of route out the excess on this side so that I can fit the polycap in there, and I just drilled a hole, and there you go, instant gap fill. Hopefully this video was helpful for you guys. Hopefully I didn't miss anything and overlook any facts, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments down below, and I'll try my best to get back to you. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.